In the stillness of midnight, the faint hum of the 24-hour laundromat sign glowed as the lone beacon of life in the sleepy town of Westhaven. But behind the ordinary routine of spinning washers and dryers, a mystery was taking root. Sheriff Sam Carter, a man weighed down by his own painful memories, was drawn to the sight of a young girl, Mia, alone at the laundromat each night. The more he observed, the stronger his sense of unease grew, compelling him to investigate. Little did he know, this seemingly simple case would unravel into a life-altering journey of connection, healing, and hope. What story was hidden in the quiet determination of this child, and how could her silent struggle reach the heart of a man who'd long closed himself off? Before we begin this powerful story of resilience and compassion, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. Bookmark. In the quiet, rural town of Westhaven, nightfall brought a calm unlike any other. Streets that had bustled during the day with families and farmhands now lay empty, the silence interrupted only by the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional passing of a lone car. Sheriff Sam Carter, a fixture of the town's law enforcement for over 2 decades, sat in his patrol car on Main Street. He took a long sip from his lukewarm coffee, his tired blue eyes scanning the stillness, alert as ever, though his face showed the years and weight of his work. At 55, Sam Carter was well-worn, like an old leather jacket. He had spent the past 7 years on the night shift, a choice his colleagues never quite understood. Most preferred the daylight hours, those filled with the sights and sounds of community life. But for Sam, the night had its own purpose. The endless dark hours were his time to escape, to avoid the questions and interactions that came with living in a town so close-knit everyone knew one another's sorrows and joys. And while the night had a haunting stillness, it was a refuge, a place he could finally put his memories to rest, at least for a little while. Beside him on the dash was a small photo, wedged securely into the corner. The snapshot showed a younger Sam with his wife, Lena, and their daughter, Grace. Grace, with her tiny pigtails and the infectious smile of a 6-year-old, looked up at her mother, Lena, who wore the gentle expression Sam missed every single day. It had been almost a decade since the accident, but to Sam, it was a loss that felt fresh each time he looked at that photo. Setting his coffee down, Sam turned away from the picture and glanced down the street. The small businesses that lined Westhaven's Main Street were dark now, their lights shut off hours ago. Only the 24-hour diner on the corner and the coin-wash laundromat down the street gave off any hint of life. He often caught sight of a few late-night regulars at the diner, usually a trucker passing through or a handful of teenagers finishing up after a high school game. The laundromat, on the other hand, was almost always empty this time of night. But tonight, as his eyes drifted toward the laundromat's windows, something caught his attention. A small figure moving slowly toward the entrance. Curious, Sam leaned forward, squinting through the dim streetlight to get a better view. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark brown skin and her hair braided neatly. She wore a faded pink jacket, slightly too big for her, and in her arms she carried a small overstuffed bag. Sam frowned, wondering why a child would be out this late, especially alone. He watched as the girl slipped into the laundromat, pushing open the glass door with both hands, and disappeared from view. For a moment, Sam thought of going over to check on her, but he hesitated. Maybe she was there with a parent, he reasoned. Perhaps they were catching up on laundry after a long day. There were 100 reasons why he didn't need to interfere, yet something about the girl stirred a strange feeling inside him, a mix of curiosity and a faint sense of unease he couldn't quite place. Shaking off the feeling, he decided to carry on with his routine patrol. Westhaven was a quiet town, and it wasn't unusual for a family to run errands at odd hours. Sam started the engine and turned down the next street, forcing his mind back to the stillness around him. But the image of the girl lingered in his mind, her small frame disappearing into the empty laundromat, clutching that oversized bag. It was probably nothing, he told himself. Just a strange sight in an otherwise predictable night. He continued his rounds, driving past the few street lamps still flickering along the sidewalks. The quiet moments that usually brought him comfort now felt unusually hollow, His mind drifted back to Grace, the way she used to sit in his lap, helping him drive, with her tiny hands on the wheel. He hadn't let himself dwell on these memories in years. But tonight, they pressed their way back, as vivid as ever. By the time he looped back to Main Street, the clock on his dashboard read 11:30 p.m. As he approached the laundromat again, he felt that same pull to glance inside, to make sure the girl had left with whoever she had come with. Yet there she was, still in the laundromat, standing alone near one of the washing machines. Through the glass he could see her small figure as she pulled items from the bag, one piece of clothing at a time, carefully placing each into the machine. Her movements were slow and methodical, almost practiced. This was no child's careless playing. She seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Sam's heart ached with a strange kind of worry as he watched her work, sorting clothes with quiet concentration. As a sheriff, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now, his instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. This wasn't a family caught up on late-night chores or a girl out with her mother. It was a child, alone, performing a task that felt heavy and out of place for someone so young. Turning off his headlights, Sam parked across the street from the laundromat, watching from his car as the girl continued her routine. He debated his next move, unsure whether to approach her now or to wait, to see if someone would arrive to pick her up. But as the minutes ticked by, nobody else came. The laundromat remained empty, except for her. As Sam sat in his car, a troubling realization began to take shape in his mind. The laundromat, the late hour, the small child alone with a bag of clothes, these weren't just odd circumstances. There was something wrong here, something that required more than just a passing glance. The next night, Sheriff Carter found himself back on Main Street, his gaze drifting toward the laundromat almost unconsciously. He'd gone through his usual route and had even stopped by the diner, chatting with the waitress for a few minutes to distract himself. But he couldn't shake the memory of that girl. This time, he didn't have to wait long. Around 11:30 p.m., just like the night before, he spotted her small figure approaching the laundromat, wearing the same too large jacket and carrying the same overstuffed bag. She moved with a cautious purpose, her eyes darting up and down the street as if checking to make sure no one saw her. He watched as she slipped into the laundromat, the door swinging shut behind her. She didn't look around or call out for anyone. Instead, she went straight to the washing machines and began her quiet ritual of sorting, washing, and folding. Sam sat in his car, observing with a mix of concern and curiosity. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. Grace's age, he thought, a pang of sorrow twisting in his chest. He remembered how Grace used to fumble with chores, always needing a hand, always full of questions. But here was this girl, going about her business with a level of focus and self-sufficiency that was unnerving for someone so young. He decided it was time to do a little digging. Surely, if there were a new family in town, someone would know about it. Westhaven was a place where secrets didn't last long, and an unfamiliar face, especially one as young as hers, would stick out. The next morning, Sam stopped by the local elementary school under the pretense of picking up a few pamphlets on community programs. He casually asked the secretary if there had been any new students, particularly a girl around 9 or 10. She shook her head, listing off the few new families that had recently moved to town, but none of them seemed to match the description of the girl. Feeling his curiosity deepen, Sam checked in with a few residents near the laundromat, people who tended to stay up late or had businesses nearby. Mrs. Evans, an elderly woman who lived across the street from the laundromat, claimed she'd seen the girl a few times late at night. "Oh, I've noticed her, Sheriff," she said, her brow creasing. "Poor thing looks so tired. She's always alone, and I wondered if maybe her parents work late." "Did you see her with anyone else?" Sam asked, hoping for some clarification. "No, she's always alone," Mrs. Evans said with a shake of her head. "I thought about saying something, but, well, I figured it wasn't my business." Mrs. Evans's words lingered with Sam as he continued his inquiries. He stopped by a few other shops and eventually dropped in at the diner, where he struck up a conversation with Bill, the cook, who had worked the night shift as long as Sam could remember. "Yeah, I think I saw her," Bill said, nodding slowly. I thought it was weird. A little kid out that late. She usually just goes straight to the laundromat, doesn't hang around or anything. The growing number of sightings confirmed what he already suspected. The girl seemed to be entirely alone, and she had been at the laundromat for several nights in a row, carrying out her tasks in the same steady, unhurried way. Sam couldn't shake the uncomfortable thought that maybe, just maybe, this girl was in real trouble. That evening, as he made his rounds, he felt a newfound sense of urgency. He parked his patrol car across from the laundromat again, his gaze trained on the building, waiting for her to appear. Sure enough, at nearly the exact same time, he saw her small figure emerging from the shadows and slipping through the laundromat doors. She seemed even more cautious tonight, her eyes scanning the empty street before ducking inside. This time, Sam made a decision. He stepped out of his car and quietly crossed the street, positioning himself close enough to get a clear view through the laundromat's glass doors, but not so close as to draw attention. Through the window, he watched her go about her routine, carefully loading clothes into the machine, measuring out detergent, and waiting patiently as the loads started. As he observed her, Sam noticed the details he'd missed before. Her jacket, though neat, was worn at the cuffs, and her shoes had seen better days, scuffed and too big for her feet. She moved with an almost adult-like concentration, her face set in a way that made her seem older than her years. It was as though she carried a weight on her small shoulders, a seriousness that seemed misplaced for someone so young. Just then, he heard quiet footsteps behind him, and turned to see Miss Diane, a middle-aged woman who worked as a waitress at the diner, walking her dog. She paused when she saw him standing by the laundromat, glancing curiously at the sheriff. "Evening, Sheriff," she greeted him with a nod. Her gaze drifted to the laundromat window, where the girl was busy folding clothes. "Oh, that little girl again. I've seen her around here every night this week." Sam nodded, surprised that even Diane had noticed. "You ever see her with anyone?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Diane shook her head, her face softening with concern. "No, she's always alone." "It's strange, isn't it? A child out here, doing laundry at this hour? It just doesn't sit right with me." Bookmark murmured his agreement, and Diane continued on her way, her brow furrowed as she glanced back at the laundromat. Her unease mirrored his own, and he could sense that other people in town were beginning to share his concern. This was no passing curiosity anymore. It was something that called for action. Returning his attention to the girl, he felt a wave of determination settle over him. He couldn't let this go any longer. There was clearly something amiss, something that required more than a passing glance from the sheriff. He needed to approach this carefully, to understand her situation before deciding his next steps. As he watched her folding clothes with quiet precision, Sam made a silent promise to himself. He'd find out who this girl was, and he'd get to the bottom of why she was here, night after night, all alone. Sheriff Carter couldn't get the girl out of his mind. Each night she appeared at the laundromat, repeating her strange, solitary routine, and each night, his worry grew. He decided it was time to act, to piece together what little he knew and see if there was anyone who could provide more insight into her situation. The next morning, Sam stopped by Nora's Market, a small grocery shop just down the block from the laundromat. It was the type of place where locals gathered, sharing small-town gossip while they picked up milk or bread. If anyone had seen or heard anything about a young girl hanging around, it would be Nora. As he entered, the small bell above the door rang, and Nora looked up from the counter, her face breaking into a smile. "Morning, Sheriff. What brings you by so early?" "Morning, Nora," Sam replied with a nod, keeping his tone light. "I was just wondering if you've noticed a little girl around here lately, coming and going near the laundromat? She's about 9 or 10, usually alone, out pretty late." Nora's expression shifted as she thought for a moment, her brows knitting together. "You know, I did see a girl like that a couple of nights back. She was all by herself, carrying a bag almost as big as she was. It seemed odd, but I figured she was just waiting for her folks or something." "Did you happen to see anyone with her?" Sam asked. Nora shook her head. "Not that I recall. She just slipped out of sight before I could get a good look. It was strange, though. I almost went over to say something, but I figured it was none of my business." Sam nodded, thanking her. It was the same story he'd been hearing, a strange sight, enough to catch attention, but not enough for anyone to act. It wasn't until he'd made the rounds over the last few days talking with other residents that he realized just how many people had noticed her and felt uneasy about it. Ed, the gas station attendant, had seen her a few times, as had Mrs. Lang, who worked at the pharmacy. Each one echoed the same sentiments: concern, surprise, and a reluctance to interfere. That afternoon, Sam stopped by the local diner for a coffee, needing a moment to gather his thoughts. The place was half empty, with a few regulars scattered at tables. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard two women at a nearby booth talking in low voices, but loud enough that he couldn't help but catch snippets of their conversation. "Seen her every night, poor thing. No kid should be out at that hour, right?" one of them said. The other woman nodded, her voice tinged with worry. "I know, it's strange. I don't see any parents with her, not once. Maybe someone should, I don't know, call someone. It's not right." Hearing them echo his own concerns made Sam's resolve even stronger. This girl wasn't just some child waiting for her parents. She was alone, and others were starting to notice too. He couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, as he resumed his patrol, Sam felt a new weight of responsibility. He drove slowly down Main Street, his gaze fixed on the laundromat. When he parked across from the building, he noticed that same small figure already inside, diligently sorting clothes into the washing machines, as if it were her personal routine. Steeling himself, Sam got out of his patrol car and crossed the street, the late-night quiet making his footsteps sound louder than he intended. As he reached the laundromat's door, he paused, watching her through the glass. Up close, he could see her better now, the way her jacket hung loosely from her small shoulders, the oversized sleeves covering her hands as she fed coins into the machine. Her face was tense with concentration, her eyes fixed on her work, almost as if she were blocking out the world around her. Gently, Sam pushed open the door, the small bell above it chiming softly. The girl, Nia, as he would soon learn her name, looked up, her eyes widening slightly before darting back down. She quickly shifted to the other side of the machine, putting a bit of distance between herself and him, her posture tense and guarded. Sam offered her a small smile, his voice low and calm. "Hey there," he greeted. "I'm Sheriff Carter. Do you mind if I ask your name?" Nia's hands stilled, gripping the edge of the machine tightly, her dark eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. She didn't say a word, her gaze flicking toward the door as if calculating her chances of escaping if she needed to. "It's okay," Sam said, crouching down to her eye level, trying to seem as non-threatening as possible. "I just want to make sure you're all right." Nia didn't answer, but she didn't run either. She stood there, eyes darting between him and the exit, her whole body tense like a cornered animal. Sam noticed the small bag on the floor beside her, filled with a few worn clothes and a threadbare blanket peeking out from the top. His heart clenched at the sight. This was no temporary situation. Before he could ask anything else, the bell above the door chimed again, and they both turned to see a woman entering. She was holding a large basket of laundry, her expression changing to surprise when she spotted the sheriff inside with Nia. Sam straightened up, nodding politely as the woman gave him a curious glance. "Nia," the woman called softly, her voice warm but distant, and the girl offered a small wave, her face tight with unease. The woman nodded in greeting to Sam, murmured something under her breath, then moved to a nearby washing machine and began loading clothes. Sam felt a pang of relief. Perhaps this woman was a relative or a family friend, someone who might be taking care of Nia after all. But as he watched them, something felt off. The woman barely acknowledged Nia, keeping her eyes down as she went about her own laundry, and Nia moved away from both of them, keeping her distance. If she was a family member or caregiver, there was no sign of warmth or familiarity between them. After a moment, Nia sat on the bench by the wall, folding her clothes with precise, practiced movements. She didn't once glance in the woman's direction. Sam hesitated, torn between his duty to dig deeper and the risk of overstepping in what could be a delicate situation. As the woman finished loading her clothes, she gave a polite nod to Sam and left without a word, leaving Nia alone once again. The laundromat felt oddly empty, the silence almost too loud. Sam watched her for a moment longer, feeling the weight of his next step pressing on him. It was clear to him now that something was seriously wrong, and it was time to act. He couldn't simply walk away this time. The laundromat was quiet, save for the hum of the washing machines and the soft rustle of clothes being folded. Sheriff Carter's gaze remained fixed on the small figure before him, and with a steadying breath, he took a step closer to her. He wanted to choose his words carefully, to find a way to reassure her that he meant no harm. "Nia, is it?" he asked gently, trying to make his voice as soft as possible. He'd heard the woman address her by name, and now he felt a bit closer, more real, calling her by it. Nia didn't respond, but she looked up, her wary eyes searching his face. Her posture remained defensive, one small hand gripping her laundry bag as though it were her only lifeline. Sam crouched down again, keeping a respectable distance, showing her he wasn't there to make any sudden moves. "I've seen you here a few nights now," he began, his tone calm and warm, "and I just wanted to check that you're okay. I know it can be difficult to be out so late by yourself." Nia's eyes flickered briefly, a flash of fear giving way to something softer, but she still didn't speak. She simply hugged her bag closer, her shoulders tight. Sam's heart ached, seeing her like this. He could tell she wasn't used to trust. She was too guarded, too practiced in being alone and unnoticed. "I'm not here to get you in trouble," he continued, sensing her anxiety. "I'm just concerned. I'm the sheriff here in Westhaven, and it's my job to look out for everyone, especially someone as young as you." Nia's fingers relaxed slightly on the bag's strap, though her expression was still guarded. Sam felt encouraged by this small response, deciding to gently push a bit further. "Do you have family here in town, Nia?" he asked, his voice still soft. "Anyone who knows you're here?" A tiny shake of her head was the only response he got. Sam's concern deepened, and he realized just how fragile this situation was. It had been so long since he'd had to approach a child alone in such vulnerable circumstances, and he had to remind himself to move slowly, with patience. Just then, Nia glanced back at the door, as if preparing to bolt, her gaze quick and calculating. Sam sensed her desire to flee, her entire body language screaming that she didn't want to be here, especially not answering questions from an adult. "Look, if you're uncomfortable, that's okay," he said quickly, trying to reassure her. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to, but I'd like to help you if you'll let me." For a moment, Nia's expression softened, and she seemed to consider his offer. She finally opened her mouth, as if to speak, but the words appeared to get stuck, her small frame visibly trembling. She was so young, yet the weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders. Sam could only imagine the things she might have been through already. Just when it looked like she might say something, the door to the laundromat chimed again. Nia's gaze snapped to it, her body instantly tensing, and Sam could see her instinct to flee resurfacing. He looked over his shoulder to see a group of young adults, loud and laughing as they entered, oblivious to the tension in the room. They glanced briefly at Sam and Nia, but quickly turned to their own laundry. When Sam turned back, Nia was on her feet, her hand gripping the strap of her bag, her face pale with fear. It was clear she was ready to make her escape, and Sam knew he had only a brief moment to act before she bolted. "Nia, wait," he said softly, but firmly enough to catch her attention. "If you need anything at all, you can always find me. I'm here most nights. I just want to help." Nia paused, her gaze shifting back to him. For a fleeting second, something in her expression softened, and Sam thought he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. But just as quickly, it disappeared, replaced by the wary, guarded look she wore like a shield. Without another word, Nia slipped around him, moving quickly toward the door. She kept her head down, her body language cautious and controlled as she maneuvered around the small group of strangers. Sam watched helplessly as she disappeared into the night, the door chiming softly as it closed behind her. Sam sat down heavily on one of the benches, running a hand over his face. She was gone, and he hadn't managed to learn a single thing about her. His heart ached with frustration. He knew that there was only so much he could do in a situation like this. He couldn't force her to open up, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing either. He stayed there for a few moments, gathering his thoughts and mentally replaying the conversation. Naya's wariness, her silence, the way she clung to her bag, these details left him more unsettled than ever. He felt the familiar tug of his instincts as a sheriff, urging him to take action, but there was more to it now. This wasn't just about a job or responsibility. It was about doing the right thing for a child who clearly needed help, whether she wanted to admit it or not. The next morning, he decided he would follow up more formally. He'd check with child services to see if they had any information about her, or if anyone had reported a missing child matching her description. In a town as small as Westhaven, records on kids were limited, and he hoped to find even the smallest detail that might shed light on Naya's situation. By mid-morning, Sam was sitting in his office at the sheriff's station, phone in hand, sifting through the little information he could gather. He called social services and explained the situation, describing the girl as best he could without alarming anyone or making assumptions. The woman on the other end was sympathetic, but unhelpful. "I'm sorry, Sheriff Carter," she said, "but we haven't had any reports of a missing child matching that description, at least not locally. I can put out a notice if you'd like, but without more details, it might be difficult." He thanked her, feeling deflated. It was as if Nia didn't exist, her presence in the laundromat a mystery with no clues or leads. He thought about her small bag, the only sign that she might be carrying her life on her shoulders, and felt a deep-seated frustration at the walls he seemed to be hitting. For all he knew, she might not have anyone at all. But Sam was nothing if not persistent. He would ask around town, especially with people who lived closer to the laundromat, and keep an eye out for her. Maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to reach her that didn't involve her running away. That night, Sheriff Carter made his rounds with a renewed sense of determination. The image of Nia slipping out of the laundromat lingered with him all day, and he knew he couldn't simply let her fade back into the shadows. There were too many unanswered questions, and too much at stake if he didn't act. At around 11 p.m., he parked his patrol car in his usual spot across from the laundromat. He kept the headlights off and waited, his gaze fixed on the door, hoping she would come by as she had every night before. As the minutes ticked by, he began to wonder if his presence the night before had scared her away for good. But then, at precisely 11:30 p.m., her small figure appeared at the far end of the block, emerging from the dimly lit alleyway with her bag slung over one shoulder. Sam felt his heart ease just a bit. This time he promised himself he wouldn't confront her head-on. He'd watch, observe her movements, and see if he could get a sense of where she went when she left the laundromat. He watched as Nia approached the laundromat's door, glancing around to make sure she was alone. Her eyes passed over his patrol car, but she didn't seem to notice him in the darkness. After a few seconds, she slipped inside, the door closing softly behind her. Sam waited for her to settle in before slowly getting out of his car. He moved carefully, sticking to the shadows, his boots making almost no sound as he crossed the street. He positioned himself just outside the laundromat window, far enough back to avoid her line of sight, and peered inside. Nia was already at work, sorting her clothes into a machine with the same careful, practiced precision. She seemed almost unaware of her surroundings, focused on the rhythm of her routine. Sam couldn't shake the thought that it was a routine she'd repeated many times before. A solitary ritual that spoke of necessity, not choice. He waited patiently, watching as she started the washing machine and took a seat on the small bench near the back of the laundromat. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them as she watched the machine spin, her expression distant and weary. Sam's heart went out to her, this small figure who seemed so alone in the world. He felt the weight of his responsibility more keenly than ever, knowing that he couldn't simply walk away. After about 20 minutes, Nia began gathering her things, her movements quick and purposeful. She took her freshly washed clothes, folded them neatly, and stuffed them back into her bag. Sam watched as she stood, glanced around the empty laundromat one last time, and headed for the door. He backed away, slipping into the shadows as she exited, her small figure illuminated briefly under the streetlight before she turned down the side alley. Sam felt a surge of urgency, He couldn't let her disappear into the night without knowing where she was going. He followed her at a careful distance, staying far enough back to avoid being seen, but close enough to keep her in sight. The alley wound through the back streets of Westhaven, an area he knew well from his years of patrolling. He watched as she moved quickly and quietly, darting through the shadows as if she'd memorized each twist and turn. But then, as she neared the edge of town, Naya suddenly glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she spotted him in the distance. Sam froze, cursing himself for not staying hidden. Her face went pale, and without a second's hesitation, she bolted, her small figure disappearing around the corner. "Wait, Nia," he called out, his voice echoing down the empty street. But she didn't stop, her footsteps quick and frantic as she tried to escape. Sam took off after her, his heart pounding as he wove through the narrow alleyways in pursuit. He could hear her footsteps ahead, light and swift, as she dodged through the maze-like streets, trying to lose him. He was surprised at how quick and agile she was, moving with the speed of someone well-practiced in running from others. As they neared the edge of town, Sam realized where they were headed. Up ahead loomed the Westhaven cemetery, its iron gate standing open, casting long shadows across the ground. Nia slipped through the gates, disappearing into the maze of gravestones, and Sam hesitated for a split second, the eerie silence of the cemetery sending a chill down his spine. But he pressed on, his focus unwavering. He couldn't lose her, not when he was so close to finding out what was going on. Inside the cemetery, the darkness seemed to thicken, the headstones casting long shadows that shifted with the flickering streetlights. Sam slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the gravestones and statues for any sign of movement. His footsteps echoed faintly on the gravel path, and he called out, his voice low and steady, "Nia, it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." The only response was silence. Sam took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm as he moved deeper into the cemetery. He checked behind each large headstone, peering into every shadowy corner, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Frustration and worry gnawed at him as he continued his search, his mind racing with possibilities. What if she was hiding, scared and alone? Or worse, what if something happened to her in this maze of tombstones? Just as he was about to give up, he caught a faint rustling sound from the far side of the cemetery, near the old oak tree. He made his way over, his steps slow and careful, and as he rounded the corner, he saw a small figure crouched behind a gravestone, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. "Naya," he called out softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move, her face hidden in the crook of her arm. She looked so small, so fragile at that moment, and Sam felt a wave of protectiveness surge through him. "I'm not here to scare you," he continued, taking a few steps closer. "I just want to make sure you're safe. That's all." Slowly, Naya lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed and weary. She looked at him, her face a mixture of fear and something else, something like resignation. She didn't say a word, just sat there, staring at him with a defeated look in her eyes. Sam took a deep breath, his heart breaking at the sight. "You don't have to be alone," he said softly. "If you need help, I'm here. I can help you. But you have to let me in." Nia's gaze held his for a long moment, and then, without warning, she turned and darted away. Slipping through a gap in the fence on the far side of the cemetery, Sam made a move to follow, but stopped, realizing that any further pursuit would only drive her farther away. As he watched her small figure disappear into the night, Sam felt a surge of helplessness and frustration. He had been so close, yet she remained just out of reach, slipping away like a ghost into the shadows. But as he walked back to his patrol car, he made a vow to himself. He wouldn't stop until he'd gotten through to her. Whatever it took, he would find a way to help Nia. She wasn't just another lost child in his town, she was someone he felt bound to protect. And he wasn't about to give up. The following night, Sheriff Carter parked his patrol car across from the laundromat even earlier than usual. He had spent the entire day thinking about Nia's flight through the cemetery, her small figure huddled behind a gravestone and the haunted look in her eyes. He couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Nia was not just a curious case or an oddity in the quiet town of Westhaven. She was a child in real trouble. The clock on his dashboard, ticked past 11:15 p.m., and just as he'd hoped, Nia's figure appeared down the street. Her movements seemed more cautious tonight, as if she were scanning for any sign of him. He stayed out of sight, watching her as she entered the laundromat with her small, overstuffed bag slung over her shoulder. This time, he knew he needed to approach it differently. He had been too direct the night before, and it had only scared her off. Tonight, he would wait, give her space, and hopefully build enough trust to get her to talk. He settled in, watching from his car as she went through the familiar motions, loading clothes, carefully measuring out detergent, and folding each item with deliberate care. Her actions were so precise, almost like a ritual. It was as if she'd done this countless times before, and Sam couldn't shake the heartbreaking thought that this laundromat might be one of the few constants in her life. After about an hour, Nia finished folding her clothes and sat down on the bench, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world pressed down on her small frame. She set her bag on the floor beside her, her head drooping as she rested it on her knees. Sam felt a pang of worry as he noticed her eyelids flutter, her body swaying slightly. He watched in quiet disbelief as Nia shifted, curling up on the hard, narrow bench, her head resting against her bundled-up jacket. Within minutes, she had drifted off to sleep, her small chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The sight struck him like a physical blow. Here was this young girl, sleeping on a cold metal bench in a laundromat, alone in the middle of the night. Sam had seen a lot in his years as sheriff, but nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. He sat there, staring at her peaceful face, trying to piece together the full weight of her situation. It was clear now that Nia didn't have a home. The laundromat wasn't just a place for her to wash clothes. It was a refuge, a place where she felt safe enough to let her guard down, even if only for a few hours. A surge of emotion welled up in him. Memories of Grace, his own daughter, filled his mind, the way she used to fall asleep in his arms, feeling secure and loved. He couldn't shake the image of his little girl, safe in her bed, while Nia was curled up here, vulnerable and alone. It was more than he could bear. He got out of his car and crossed the street, moving quietly so as not to startle her. He slipped into the laundromat, the door chiming softly, but Nia didn't stir. She was deeply asleep, her small hands clutching the fabric of her jacket as if holding on to the only thing familiar to her. Sam knelt down beside the bench, his heart heavy as he looked at her closely for the first time. Her face, peaceful in sleep, held traces of exhaustion and a quiet resilience that no child should have to bear. There were faint shadows under her eyes, and her cheeks were slightly hollow, as though she hadn't had a good meal in days. He wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but he held back, not wanting to wake her just yet. Instead, he sat down on the floor beside her, keeping watch. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there, but time seemed to stand still as he sat vigil over her. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her, not tonight. After a while, Nia began to stir, her eyelashes fluttering as she slowly came back to consciousness. Her eyes opened, and for a moment she seemed confused, looking around with a mixture of disorientation and fear. But when she noticed Sam sitting beside her, she froze, her body tensing. "Hey, it's okay," Sam said softly, lifting his hands in a gesture of peace. "I didn't mean to startle you. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." Nia sat up quickly, clutching her bag to her chest, her eyes wide and wary. She didn't say anything, but she didn't run either. Her gaze darted around the room, as though calculating her options. "You don't have to be afraid," he continued gently. "I know it's hard to trust, but I'm here to help you, Nia. That's all I want." She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with a mix of fear and something else, maybe a flicker of hope. Barely visible, but there, like a tiny light struggling to break through the darkness. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice small and hesitant. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and the fragility in her tone broke his heart all over again. "Because I was worried about you," he replied honestly. "I've seen you here night after night, and I couldn't just ignore it. I know you don't know me, and I know it's hard to trust strangers, but I'm here if you need help. You don't have to do this alone." Nia looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. She didn't say anything, but she didn't get up to leave either. Sam took it as a good sign and decided to try again. "Do you have a place to go? Somewhere safe?" he asked gently. A faint tremor ran through her and she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, it's just me." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Sam felt a lump form in his throat as he absorbed the reality of her situation. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. "Is there anyone you can stay with? Family? Friends?" he pressed, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nia shook her head again, her gaze distant. "No. My mom, she got really sick, and then she didn't wake up." Her words were simple, but they hit Sam with the force of a hurricane. He couldn't imagine what this little girl had been through, losing her mother and being left to fend for herself. The thought of her out on the streets, facing the world alone, was unbearable. "I'm so sorry, Nia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine how hard this must have been for you." Nia shrugged, her expression unreadable, as though she'd grown accustomed to hiding her feelings. But Sam could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weariness of a child who'd had to grow up far too quickly. "You don't have to keep doing this alone," he said softly. "There are people who can help you, people who want to make sure you're safe and cared for." Nia looked up at him, her gaze searching his face as if trying to determine if he was truly sincere. She seemed hesitant, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Can I trust you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Sam felt a swell of determination as he looked in her eyes. "Yes, Nia. You can trust me. I promise I won't let you down." She nodded slowly, a small, tentative gesture, but it was enough. Sam felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was only a beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you someplace safe. You don't have to be alone tonight." Nia hesitated, but then she stood up, clutching her bag tightly. As they walked out of the laundromat together, Sam knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but he was ready. He would do whatever it took to make sure Nia never had to face another night alone. As they stepped out into the quiet night, Sheriff Carter kept his pace slow, giving Nia a chance to adjust to his presence. She walked a few steps behind him, her small figure almost swallowed by the oversized jacket she clutched around her shoulders. She cast cautious glances at him from time to time, her eyes wary as if she half expected him to change his mind and leave her in the dark. Sam led her to his patrol car, opening the passenger door and giving her an encouraging nod. "You can sit up front if you'd like. It's warmer." Nia hesitated, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her bag. After a few seconds, she climbed into the seat, shifting uncomfortably as she settled in. Sam closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side, starting the engine to chase away the night's chill. The ride to the station was quiet. Nia kept her gaze fixed out the window, her small hands gripping her bag in her lap, her shoulders hunched as if she were bracing herself for something unexpected. Sam glanced over at her from time to time, wondering what she must be feeling. It was hard enough to imagine what it was like for a child to be alone in the world, but seeing it right here in the seat beside him filled him with a fierce determination to protect her. When they arrived at the station, Sam parked and turned off the engine. "The station is empty right now. We'll have a little privacy so we can talk," he assured her. Nia nodded, though her eyes remained wary. She climbed out of the car, hugging her bag as if it were a shield, and followed him through the quiet corridors of the sheriff's office. Sam led her into his office, gesturing toward a small chair across from his desk. "Go ahead and sit wherever you feel comfortable," he said gently, pulling out a blanket from a nearby closet and handing it to her. "Here, it might help keep you warm." She looked at him, surprised, before accepting the blanket with a small nod. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the chair, her posture still tense, her gaze flicking around the room as if she were assessing her surroundings, taking stock of any possible exit. Sam settled into the chair across from her, leaning forward with his hands clasped, his expression calm and reassuring. "Thank you for trusting me, Nia," he began softly. "I know it can't be easy to open up to someone you don't know, but I'm here to listen, and I want to help in any way I can." Nia's eyes dropped to her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the frayed edge of her jacket. For a few moments, she was silent, as if struggling to find the right words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't know if I should be here. People don't usually help." Sam's heart ached at the quiet pain in her voice. It was clear she had learned, far too young, to be wary of kindness, to distrust offers of help. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that things could be different, but he knew she needed time to believe it. "Sometimes people are afraid to ask for help," he said gently, choosing his words carefully. "But that doesn't mean they don't deserve it. I can't imagine what it's been like for you, Nia, but I do know you don't have to face it alone anymore. You have me now." Nia looked up, her dark eyes searching his face, as if looking for any sign of deception. She seemed to consider his words, the tension in her shoulders softening just a little. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of vulnerability beneath her guarded expression. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "My mom, she always said we'd be okay. Even when things got really hard, she kept saying we'd be fine." Sam nodded, listening intently. He could sense the weight of her memories, the invisible scars that seemed to weigh down her every word. "But then she got sick," Nia continued, her voice trembling. "She said she'd get better, but she didn't. And then she was gone." The words hung in the air, heavy with grief and loss. Sam could see the pain in her eyes, the lingering sadness of a child who'd been forced to grow up too soon. He wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but he knew that his words wouldn't erase the sorrow she carried. All he could do was listen, to let her know that someone cared. "I'm so sorry, Nia," he said softly, his voice filled with empathy. "Losing someone you love, it's never easy, and having to go through it alone, that's more than anyone should have to bear." Nia swallowed, her gaze dropping back to her lap. "After she was gone, I didn't know what to do. We didn't have anyone else, so I just tried to keep going. I thought if I stayed out of sight, maybe nobody would notice me." Her words brought a swell of sadness to Sam's chest, and he felt an overwhelming need to protect her, to show her that she wasn't invisible, that she mattered. "Nia, you've been so brave," he said gently. "You've been through more than most people could ever imagine, and you've managed to survive all on your own. But you don't have to keep doing this alone. You're not invisible here. You're seen, and you're cared for." Nia's eyes met his, a glimmer of something fragile and hopeful in her gaze. Do you mean that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I do," Sam replied firmly, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm here for you, Nia, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you have a safe, warm place to call home. You deserve that." She looked away, her expression unreadable, but he could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was a small gesture, but it gave him hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. After a few moments of silence, Sam gently continued. "There are people who can help, people who can make sure you're safe and cared for. I'd like to reach out to some of them, but only if you're comfortable with it." Nia hesitated, her gaze flicking back to him. She seemed to consider his words carefully, the tension in her posture slowly easing. After a long pause, she gave a small nod. "All right," she murmured, "but only if you promise to stay." Sam felt a surge of warmth at her words. "I promise, Nia," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm not going anywhere. You're safe with me." She looked at him, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and vulnerability, and for the first time Sam saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. It was a fragile thing, but it was there, a small spark of trust that he knew he had to nurture carefully. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the night slowly lifting. For the first time since he'd met her, Nia seemed to relax, her guard dropping just enough for him to see the child beneath the hardship. And as he watched her, Sam felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was only the beginning, but he was determined to see it through. He would do whatever it took to make sure Nia never had to face the world alone again. She was safe now, and he would be there for her, today, tomorrow, and for as long as she needed him. The days that followed brought a whirlwind of changes for both Sheriff Carter and Nia. True to his word, Sam stayed by her side, guiding her through each new step with the patience and care she had never known before. At first, she seemed overwhelmed by everything, the strange faces, the unfamiliar routines, and the simple fact that, for the first time in a long while, someone was looking out for her. But slowly, she started to settle in, her initial wariness giving way to a cautious sense of comfort. After their late-night conversation, Sam reached out to social services, explaining Nia's situation as carefully as he could without pushing her too hard. Monica Reese, a caseworker with kind eyes and a gentle manner, met with them at the sheriff's station to discuss possible living arrangements. Sam could see the worry flicker across Nia's face as she listened to Monica speak about temporary housing and family placement options. He knew she feared being shuffled from one place to another, left to navigate yet another unfamiliar setting. But Sam had already made a decision. When Monica was finished explaining, he cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed both her and Nia. "If it's all right with you, Monica, and with you, Nia, I'd like her to stay with me. Just temporarily, of course," he added quickly, catching Monica's surprised expression. "Until we figure out a more permanent solution." Nia looked at him, a mixture of surprise and relief softening her gaze. For the first time, she seemed to relax, her shoulders easing as if a weight had been lifted. Monica took a thoughtful pause before nodding. "It's unconventional, Sheriff, but if you're serious about this, well, we can start with temporary guardianship and assess from there. I'll need to conduct a few checks and fill out the necessary paperwork, but considering the circumstances, I don't see why we can't make this work." Sam's heart swelled with a sense of purpose. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental to him. He had been granted the chance to give Nia the stability she so desperately needed, and he wasn't about to take it for granted. The first few nights at Sam's home were tentative, marked by Nia's quiet presence and her tendency to keep to herself. Sam noticed her clutching her bag tightly, as if afraid it might be taken away, even though he'd offered her a drawer for her clothes and a small closet where she could store her belongings. Not wanting to push her, Sam decided to ease her in gradually. He prepared a simple dinner each evening, usually something familiar like soup or pasta, and invited her to join him at the table. At first, Nia picked at her food, her gaze darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. But by the third night, she began to eat with a bit more appetite, even managing a small smile when Sam offered her a piece of pie he'd picked up from the local diner. As they settled into this new routine, Sam noticed small changes in her demeanor. Her eyes no longer held the same haunted look, and she seemed less guarded, even pausing to listen as he told her stories from his days as a young deputy. Occasionally, she would even ask him questions, her curiosity sparking as she grew more comfortable. One Saturday morning, as they sat in the kitchen over breakfast, Sam decided to introduce a little tradition he used to share with his daughter, Grace. "How do you feel about pancakes?" he asked, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Nia looked up, her expression cautious but intrigued. I like pancakes," she said quietly. Sam grinned, grabbing the mixing bowl and a bag of flour. "Well, you're in luck. Saturday pancakes are a bit of a tradition around here. Let's see if you can help me make them as good as Grace used to." Nia's face softened at the mention of Grace, but instead of retreating, she nodded, moving hesitantly toward the counter. Together, they mixed the batter, with Sam guiding her through each step. By the time they were flipping pancakes on the stove, Nia was smiling, a small, genuine smile that warmed Sam's heart. As they sat down to eat, Sam felt a quiet sense of pride. It was a small gesture, but it was a step toward making her feel at home, toward building something familiar and safe. In the evenings, Sam introduced another small routine. After dinner, he'd bring out a book and read a chapter aloud while Nia listened quietly. Sometimes she'd sit across from him, other times she'd curl up in the armchair by the window, her face softening as she lost herself in the story. Sam had chosen a few children's books, simple and comforting, hoping to give her a bit of the childhood she'd missed. One evening, after he finished reading, Nia looked up at him, her gaze filled with a question she'd clearly been holding back. "Sheriff Carter? Do you think I could call you Sam?" she asked, her voice tentative. The question caught him off guard, but he smiled, nodding warmly. "Of course you can. Whatever makes you comfortable, Nia." Her lips quirked in a small smile, and she murmured, "Thank you, Sam." Each small step, each bit of trust she extended, filled Sam with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew it would take time for her to fully let down her guard, but he was willing to wait, to show her that he was here for the long haul. As the weeks passed, Naya began to feel more at ease in his home. She started leaving her bag in her room instead of carrying it everywhere. And she would sometimes greet him in the morning with a quiet, "Good morning," instead of the silence that had greeted him before. She even helped him with small chores around the house, folding laundry with the same meticulous care she'd shown at the laundromat and taking quiet pride in her work. One evening, as they were putting away the dishes, Sam decided to gently broach the topic of school. "Nia, I was thinking," he began, keeping his tone light. "If you'd like, we could look into getting you enrolled in school. There's a nice one just a few blocks from here." She hesitated, her brow furrowing. "School?" she repeated, the word heavy with uncertainty. Sam nodded. "Yes, but only if you feel ready. It might be nice to have some friends your age, and the teachers there are very kind. They'll understand that you're starting fresh." Nia seemed to mull it over, her gaze distant as if weighing the possibility. She didn't answer right away, but Sam could see the thought had sparked something in her. He decided to leave it at that, knowing she needed time to consider the idea. As they settled into their quiet evening routine, Sam couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope. For the first time in years, his house felt full again, filled with the warmth and energy that Nia brought. Though her presence was subtle, a quiet resilience woven into each day, it was enough to remind him of why he'd chosen this path. This life he was building with Nia wasn't perfect, nor was it easy, but it was something real, something they were building together. And with each small moment of connection, he could see a future filled with promise, a future where Nia wouldn't have to face the world alone, and where he wouldn't have to live with the ache of solitude. It was a beginning, and Sam knew it was one worth holding on to. As winter gave way to spring, the routines that Sheriff Carter and Nia had built together grew more natural, their lives slowly intertwining in ways neither had anticipated. Nia's wariness began to ease, replaced by a quiet confidence that she was, at last, in a safe place. She no longer jumped at every sound, and her guarded glances softened, revealing glimpses of the child she once had been. At that time, Sam couldn't shake the sense that this bond was more than temporary. He had grown to care deeply for Nia, and she had become a part of his life that he couldn't imagine letting go. Though he knew it was a serious commitment, the idea of adopting her had started to feel like not only the right choice, but the only choice. Sam wanted to give her a permanent home, a place where she would always belong. The next step was to meet with Monica, the caseworker, and formally express his intention. Sam set up an appointment, and on a sunny Tuesday morning, they sat together in Monica's small office, where he outlined his wish to adopt Nia. Monica listened thoughtfully, her gaze warm and understanding. "Sheriff Carter, I can tell that you genuinely care for Nia. And while this isn't a typical situation, it's clear that you two have developed a bond that's deeply important to both of you. Are you certain this is what you want? Adopting a child is a life-changing commitment." Sam nodded, his voice steady with conviction. "I've never been more sure of anything. She's already become a part of my life, and I want to give her a home, one where she knows she's loved and where she belongs." Monica smiled, nodding in approval. "Then let's start the process. There will be a series of home visits, interviews, and assessments, of course, but I believe we can move things along as quickly as possible. Nia deserves stability, and if you're ready to provide that for her, we'll work to make it happen." As they left the office, Sam felt a mix of anticipation and determination. He knew the path ahead would be challenging. There were countless hurdles to clear, and he was ready to face every one of them. For Nia's sake, he would do whatever it took to make her feel safe, loved, and wanted. When Sam finally sat down with Nia to talk about his plan to adopt her, he chose his words carefully, not wanting to overwhelm her. They were in the living room after dinner, her favorite book resting in her lap as she looked at him with curiosity. "Nia," he began gently, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything we've been through together. And, if it's something you'd want, I'd like to make things official. I'd like to adopt you so that you have a permanent home here with me." For a moment she didn't respond, her expression one of stunned surprise. Her eyes searched his face as if trying to understand if he truly meant it. Then, slowly, a small smile crept onto her face. A smile filled with hope and a hint of disbelief. "You mean, really?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, really," Sam replied, his voice soft but unwavering. "I want you to be a part of my family, Nia. You don't have to decide right away, but I wanted you to know that this is something I want, and I'll do everything I can to make it work." Nia's gaze dropped to her hands, and Sam could see the emotion flickering across her face. She looked up at him again. Her eyes filled with tears and nodded. I'd like that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to stay with you." At that moment, Sam felt his heart swell with joy and gratitude. He reached over, taking her small hands in his, and gave them a gentle squeeze. "Then we'll make it happen together." The days that followed were filled with meetings, home assessments, and visits from social workers. Monica and a few other caseworkers came by several times to check on them, and each visit went smoothly, with Nia slowly opening up to the new people in her life. Sam watched with pride as she answered their questions, her voice gaining confidence each time, a quiet determination in her gaze. One afternoon, as they wrapped up another home visit, Nia's caseworker, Monica, leaned over and spoke to Sam in a low voice, her tone warm. "You know, Sheriff, I think this is one of the most positive cases I've worked on. It's clear that you both bring out the best in each other." Sam smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "She's a remarkable kid," he replied, watching as Nia played with their dog in the backyard, "and I feel lucky to have her in my life." The day of the adoption hearing finally arrived, a moment that felt both surreal and deeply significant. Sam sat in the courthouse, Nia beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly as they waited for the judge to call their case. He looked down at her, offering a reassuring smile, and she gave him a small but steady nod. When their case was called, they entered the courtroom together, standing before the judge. Sam presented his case with sincerity and determination, explaining how much Nia meant to him and how he was committed to providing her with a loving, stable home. The judge listened carefully, her gaze moving between Sam and Nia as she considered the case. After a few moments, she smiled warmly. "Having reviewed the documents and spoken with both parties, I am pleased to approve this adoption," she announced. "Congratulations, Sheriff Carter. Nia, you are now officially part of a family." A round of quiet applause filled the room, and Sam felt a rush of emotion as he turned to Nia, pulling her into a warm embrace. She hugged him tightly, her face pressed against his shoulder, and he could feel the relief and happiness radiating from her. As they walked out of the courthouse, Sam looked down at Nia, his heart brimming with pride and love. "Well, Miss Nia Carter," he said with a smile, "what do you say we celebrate?" Nia grinned up at him, a sparkle in her eyes. "Can we go to the laundromat?" Sam chuckled, surprised but touched by her request. "The laundromat? Really?" She nodded, her smile softening. "It's where you found me," she said simply, "where our family started." Touched, Sam nodded, feeling his heart swell with emotion. "Then to the laundromat we go." They walked hand in hand to the laundromat, which now felt almost like a sacred place, a reminder of where their journey had begun. The familiar hum of the machines and the quiet calm of the place filled Sam with a sense of peace, a feeling that he and Nia were exactly where they were meant to be. They sat down together on the same bench where he'd first found her, lost and alone. This time, however, she leaned against him, her face serene, her heart finally at ease. In the months that followed, Sam and Nia embraced their new life together. They established small traditions: Saturday pancakes, nightly story time, and weekend trips to the park. Nia continued to grow and blossom, her laughter filling their home, her spirit brightening every corner. With each passing day, Sam felt the emptiness he'd carried for so long gradually lifting, replaced by the warmth of love and belonging. Nia was no longer a lost child in need of rescue. She was his daughter, his family, and the light that had brought new life to his world. They had found each other in the most unexpected of places, and together they had built something beautiful, an unbreakable bond, a future filled with hope, and a family born out of love. The seasons shifted, and life continued to blossom in ways that surprised both Sam and Nia. Each day brought new moments of joy, trust, and small traditions that were quickly becoming the heart of their new life together. Sam found himself looking forward to every morning, to the quiet moments over breakfast, to helping Nia pack her lunch for school, and to listening as she eagerly recounted her day in the evenings. Nia's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Where once there had been wariness and guarded silence, there was now laughter and curiosity. She had thrown herself into her schoolwork with a determination that impressed her teachers. And she even began making friends, children who welcomed her with the warmth she had never known before. Seeing her flourish brought Sam a profound sense of pride and fulfillment. One Saturday morning, as they finished their usual pancake breakfast, Nia looked up at him, her face thoughtful. "Dad?" she said softly, the word still so new and precious on her lips, but one she now used freely, her voice filled with affection. "Yes, sweetheart," Sam responded, his heart swelling with warmth at the sound of her calling him Dad. "Can we go see them?" she asked hesitantly, her gaze shifting to the photograph on the mantel. It was the one Sam had recently placed there of his late wife, Lena, and his daughter, Grace. He'd shown it to Nia a few weeks ago, introducing her to the family she would have been a part of, had things turned out differently. Sam felt a lump rise in his throat, but he smiled, nodding. "I think they'd love that, Nia. I'd love to take you to meet them." That afternoon they drove to the small, peaceful cemetery where Lena and Grace rested. Sam hadn't been there in a long time. His grief had kept him away for years, the memories too painful to confront. But now, with Nia beside him, it felt right. It felt like a way to connect his past with his present, to honor the journey that had brought him here. They walked through the quiet rows of graves until they reached the two headstones, simple and modest, nestled under the shade of an old oak tree. Sam took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache in his chest, tempered now by the warmth of Nia's hand in his. "Hi, Lena. Hi, Grace," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "This is Nia, our daughter. I think you both would have loved her." Nia stepped forward, her small hands clutching a bouquet of flowers she had picked out herself. She placed them gently on each grave, her face solemn as she looked at the names carved into the stone. "Hi," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you, but I promised to take care of him. We'll take care of each other." Sam felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, and he reached down, pulling her into a gentle embrace. They stood there in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts, their connection to the past strengthening their bond in the present. As they made their way back to the car, Sam felt a newfound sense of peace. The wounds of his past hadn't vanished, but they no longer weighed him down. In Nia, he'd found not only a reason to move forward, but also a way to honor Lena and Grace's memory, to carry them with him in a way that was healing, not haunting. Back at home, Sam and Nia continued to build a life filled with joy, support, and traditions that felt uniquely theirs. They found themselves at the laundromat on Saturday mornings, not out of necessity, but out of fondness. It had become a place of reflection for them, a reminder of where their journey had begun and of how far they'd come. One morning, as they sat on the familiar bench waiting for the wash to finish, Nia turned to him, a question in her eyes. "Dad," she began, her tone contemplative, "do you ever think about, what if you hadn't found me that night?" Sam took a deep breath, considering her words. He looked at her, the girl who had once been alone and guarded, now confident and open, her face filled with trust and love. "I think about it often, Nia," he admitted, "and every time I feel so grateful that I did. You've brought so much light into my life." She leaned into him, smiling. "I'm glad you found me too," she whispered. "I never thought I'd have a home again, or a family." Sam wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You have a family now, Nia, forever. I'll always be here for you." The years that followed were filled with milestones and memories that Sam cherished deeply. He watched with pride as Nia grew into a bright, compassionate young woman, her resilience and kindness shining through in everything she did. She excelled in school, formed friendships that blossomed into lifelong bonds, and brought warmth into his life that filled the once empty spaces in his heart. As Nia grew, Sam found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. They had both faced unimaginable loss and loneliness, yet somehow they had found each other, two souls brought together by fate. The sadness and hardship that had once defined their lives were now simply chapters in a story of healing and love, a story that they had written together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Nia turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, do you think they know? Mom and Grace, do you think they know about us?" Sam smiled, looking out over the horizon, a peaceful certainty settling over him. "I think they do," he said softly. "And I think they're happy, knowing that we're here, together." Nia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, the last rays of sunlight casting a warm glow over them, a fitting end to a day and to a story that had been marked by love, resilience, and new beginnings. Their journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Together, they would face whatever came their way, as a family. And for Sam, the sheriff who had once been so used to the silence of his empty nights, this life with Nia was more than he had ever dreamed of. It was a life full of purpose, of love, and of joy, the kind of life he had thought he'd lost forever. As they sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sam felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. His heart was no longer weighed down by sorrow. Instead, it was filled with hope for the future and with the knowledge that he and Nia had saved each other. They were, at last, home. The story of Sam and Nia has taken us on an emotional journey of love, compassion, and the power of human connection. We've watched two lonely souls find each other and discover that family doesn't have to be defined by blood. It can be found in those we choose to love and protect. Sam, once burdened by loss, found renewed purpose in caring for Nia, while Nia, who thought she had lost everything, found a place to belong and someone who truly cared. This story reminds us that sometimes life's most unexpected turns bring the greatest gifts. Meeting Nia changed everything for Sam, and her life was transformed by the love and security he gave her. In moments of hardship, compassion and kindness can become the bridges that bring us closer, helping us build a life filled with love and healing. If you found this story inspiring, please comment with 1. If you found it deeply moving, comment with 2. We'd also love to hear your stories. Please share them below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more uplifting stories like this. Let us know your thoughts about this journey in the comments below.